Thank you very much. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you, Tinta people. Thank you, the Academy people, for having me over. I apologize for not being there in person, but I had a flood in my apartment. The issue is not completely resolved, so I can't really leave my artwork for more than like a day and my books and everything because water and paper don't get along. But I'm glad to see you all. Thank you so much for coming to all the participants, Susie's class, and you in this main room. As Sada already explained, my name is Nine Bunjevac, and I'm a comics author and illustrator who was born in Canada, grew up in former Yugoslavia, and after 15 years of living in Yugoslavia, moved to Canada, where I continued my art education. One of the most difficult things for me moving to another country and speaking a new language was that one of my passions was writing. And I actually thought that I was going to be a journalist and an artist. Unfortunately, moving to Canada with a very basic knowledge of the English language, I was no longer able to write. And in time, the knowledge of my Serbo-Croatian became weaker, and my English was not good enough. That is until I took a creative writing course within the art college in Canada with a professor whose approach to storytelling, to writing, was through storytelling. That is, it's all fine to understand the grammar of the language. It's fine to understand the structure of a story. But what is the most important thing is to tell a story, storytelling. And just as I am talking to you right now, my approach would not be much much different than this. What I'm trying to say is, if you can communicate clearly your thoughts, your desires, whatever it is, you can write. And of course, the next step is to learn how to write words, letters, of course, yeah. And this really freed something in me. So after 2 years of studying at the Georgia Krstić Art School in Niš, I continued my education in Canada at a very similar program within a high school where I was learning the basics of drawing, of sculpture and ceramics, graphic design, illustration. And I continued that way, eventually studying drawing and painting at the Ontario College of Art and Design. And this is where my creative writing course that I just told you about took place. And interestingly enough, it was the last course that I had to take before I graduated. Comics have always been something that I loved very much and enjoyed. But eventually I forgot about it. I forgot about comics. And my earlier influences were Disney comics that were widely available in former Yugoslavia, the Franco-Belgian comics. But there were also a variety of other things. For those of you who remember the old Yugoslavia time, is that we enjoyed pretty good public television with some really good European films and wonderful even BBC television plays. I remember prime time broadcasting Berlin Alexanderplatz by Wim Wenders. So taking all that into consideration, I ended up specializing in drawing and painting, completely forgetting the storytelling, the writing, all the desires I had as a small child to draw comics, to write. And that is until I came across the American underground comics from the 1980s. We're not talking about the original underground comics with people such as Gilbert Sheldon and Robert Crumb, but we're talking about the 1980s comics, which I'm going to talk a little bit more about. So eventually, after graduating from the Ontario College of Art, I focused on painting for many years, and I must say, I was really not a good artist painter. I was developing my technique, but my work was very pictorial, very representational at a time where conceptual art was all the craze. So every once in a while, people would tell me, well, you're an illustrator, you are an illustrator, and I never really thought about it. Until, and this is where I'm going to share the screen. Ba, 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 ba. Okay. Host tools. Share screen. Give me a moment. Okay. This is the PDF that I prepared specially for you. I was hoping to see you in person, but unfortunately I couldn't be there. Okay. So I was basically a painter working in oil on canvas until the year 2003, where I began working on sculpture installations. So what you see on screen is a shot from a gallery exhibit at 2005 at Spin Gallery in Toronto. What I started doing after I gave up painting, and that happened sometime in 2004, I just was no longer inspired to do any painting. I started making these dolls out of polymer clay. I would sew bodies, make them out of cloth, fill them with sand, and make these tiny little clothes for the dolls. And eventually I was approached by a gallery to exhibit these dolls, and I filled the space with found objects. I made a life-size statue of myself and arranged the found objects. This is a piece that is called The Fourth Man. And this is the piece that really got me thinking about what I was doing as a way of telling a story through the creation of objects. This is a detail from one of the installations. Now give me a moment. I will just try to, there we go. So, as I said, this was more of a domain of sculpture installation for me. So I started noticing while I was arranging the objects around the space is I was starting to tell a story. And that got me thinking about perhaps that I should consider writing again and making comics. So now that basically tells you my segue to comics. Now, my earlier influences, which I just noticed, which I just basically mentioned a few moments ago, were the comics that were available in Yugoslavia at the time. And Yugoslavia enjoyed a very, very incredibly rich comics scene. There were quite a few available to us, not just Franco-Belgian, but from the American Golden Era. For example, here, Alex Raymond, whom I adored as a child, and whose comics I would read in the middle of the pages of Politikin Zabavnik. He also created Flash Gordon, which, okay, I'm not very proud of it, but I really enjoyed Flash Gordon. I enjoyed the style of the American 1930s comics from the golden era. And what I was mentioning earlier about the 1980s underground and what came out of the American 1980s underground, especially Charles Burns here in the middle. We see his collection of comics called Big Baby. But there were several others. They were all published by Raw Magazine, which was a magazine that came out of New York in the 1980s, edited by Françoise Mouly, who is the wife of Art Spiegelman, the cartoonist. And she is also now the creative director of the New Yorker magazine. This magazine, Raw Magazine, was quite groundbreaking at the time, and I came across it as a teenager in Canada. I saw a few comics, and that was simply etched in my mind, even though it would be quite some time until I would attempt to do my first comic in 2004. I kept thinking about the works of Charles Burns and Drew Friedman, who used pointillism. So we're talking about the later authors and artists that came inspired by the American underground. And on the left, we see Chester Brown, who's a Canadian cartoonist. This is his book, Louis Riel, which came out about the same time I realized that I wanted to do comics and really try to experiment and add something different into what was available out there. But Chester Brown is a type of a cartoonist that completely changed the comics industry in Canada. Louis Riel is a biography of a Métis Canadian revolutionary. It is told from the point of view of somebody who understands mental illness. Perhaps because of the visions that Louis Riel perpetrated to have experienced, the colonial structure didn't really allow for that to exist. So they basically, in the history of Canada, wrote Louis Riel as somebody who suffered from schizophrenia. Now, Chester Brown completely broke down this structure of belief that Louis Riel had a mental illness. And I really like the fact that you can do different things with comics, not just tell the story, but within the notes included in the book, in the afterword or the foreword, you can actually express a lot more and elaborate onto the story that is already there. So this is something that I took on with my own comics, including the afterword to explain. What was my motivation behind the story? Because sometimes there are certain stories that if you leave them to interpretation of the people, they can take these stories in their own way, and it can be completely fake, and they can come to conclusions that probably were not your aim. On the right, we see cover of The Diary of a Teenage Girl by Phoebe Lochner. At the time I began doing comics, I came across the work of Phoebe Lochner and was amazed at how much one can do through comics and expressing personal stories. because Phoebe Lochner writes about her own life. And of course, we're talking about influences. I have to introduce Mouse by Art Spiegelman, which showed me that far greater stories can be told through comics, not just in the realm of fantasy and biography, but we can use comics as an educational tool. Now, this is something that was also demonstrated by Louis Riel. Since Louis Riel is readily available in almost every school library in Canada right now, as is Mouse. And for those of you who don't know about the book, Art Spiegelman wrote an illustrated Mouse as a story that he told about his father and his incarceration at the Auschwitz concentration camp. Not only did he tell the story about his father, but the storyline would go back in time and then forward in time in the present time, describing this old man who had survived these horrific ordeals and how that had influenced him and changed his personality. It's brutally honest. This book is brutally honest. Especially there is a scene that I was amazed by that takes place in present day where Art Spiegelman is driving his father somewhere, and his father sees an African American person and is obviously very racist and wants to close the window and stuff like that. So brutally honest. This is where I learned that if you're going to tell a personal story, you can't pick and choose. You have to show the story in its entirety. And now going back to what happened after all of these influences and when I started experimenting with comics. The first comic I created was in 2004, and I didn't really know where I was going with that. There were some independent small magazines in Canada that I was contributing to, but other than that, I didn't know where it was going. But that is until I connected with the underground comic scene in Italy, in Croatia, and in Serbia. This was, I had already been introduced to several underground cartoonists in Toronto, but the scene, despite what people think, is really not as strong as it is in Europe. My comics for the first 8 years appeared in different underground magazines and anthologies. On the left, we see Black, an anthology of comics by the Italian publisher Coconino. And the cover was done, if you're familiar with the work of the Croatian artist Igor Hofbauer. So the theme of this magazine was the Balkan comic scene, underground comic scene. Next, you see a variety of magazines that I had contributed comics to, from Komikaze, which is a Croatian publishing outfit run by Ivana Armanini, and Love Hate is an anthology which comes out from the Crack Comics Festival in Rome. It takes place every year in December. Then we see Stripolis, the red right here, the red with a red and black cover, which is a small anthology magazine that from operating from Novi Sad in Serbia. Next to it is Asia Trauma, published by Le Dernier Cri, which is a French underground publishing outfit. Then we see Ženski strip na Balkanu, the Women, Balkans in Comics, the anthology, which was edited by Irena Jukic-Pranjic. I had done the cover for it, as well as having included several comic strips inside. The book was highly successful and sold within months. And the publisher was Fibra. Now, this continued for several years, my publishing in different magazines, until the publisher of Mineshaft magazine approached me and asked to contribute something. So now we see right here a copy of Mineshaft magazine, which published one of my comics, August 1976. So to the left, we see the cover I did for the Balkan Women in Comics. And what's very interesting is that this book made it into onto the website of Paul Gravett, who is an English, UK historian of comics. He extensively writes about comics, and he's considered to be one of the foremost authorities in comics. The cover of this book and the book appeared on his website among the best of Southeast Europe. And this is how I ended up meeting Paul Gravett, who put me in touch with Jonathan Cape, publisher from UK, which is a subsidiary of Random House UK, which is a major publishing company. So why I'm saying this is do your job well, because you never know who's watching. On the right is the Mineshaft magazine, the cover I did. So with these two things combined, my first offer for a book came from Serbia, of all places. Even though this time I was living and working in Canada, the first book of mine, the first collection, came out in Serbia. So because of this, which appeared on my blog at the time, I had a blog and I wrote about this book, and because of the cover, the Mineshaft cover here on the right, I was approached by a Canadian publisher to take on this book and publish it in English. Now, the cover from Mineshaft is here repeated on the back cover of Hladna kao led, or Heartless. And so Heartless was published in 2012. So after 8 years of making short comics and publishing in different anthologies, my first collection was published. So all of these comics were produced between 2004 and 2011. It features a character that I created, an alter ego called Zorka, who is an immigrant in North America. I had based her on the film Cat People, the original 1942 film Cat People, which is a Hollywood film in which the heroine of the film is depicted as a Serbian artist who comes from the mountains of South Serbia. And when she's aroused sexually, she becomes a wild cat and she devours her lovers. So my take on the cat woman was my Zorka was a little bit of a pathetic woman who could just not get a boyfriend, and she really never gets aroused. So these are the 2 pages from the story, the collection of stories about Zorka, called Bitter Tears of Zorka Petrovic. The title is a pun on Fassbinder's film Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant. The last story in this collection was called August 1978 in 77, in which I talk, it's an allegory, in which I take the last letter written by my mother to my father, and I make a story out of it. It's more of an allegory than a story. And I also finish it with my own views of what had been happening. I think the Sada briefly explained that my father was a member of a secret terrorist organization which operated in North America, and he was a member of a saboteur group, which means that he was building bombs and he died from his own bomb. Now, this organization was anti-communist, it was highly nationalist, and it was funded by the Orthodox Church, Serbian Orthodox Church in North America. In this story, I reject his ideology, which all of a sudden made this comic extremely popular in the Balkans. After this book came out in Serbia, it received a fabulous review in Croatia by the Croatian author Miljenko Jergovic. And after that, I think that my work came out a little bit more, became known outside of the comic circles and within literary circles, as well as different organizations that were engaged in peace building. So because of that story, I received an offer to publish the story about my father, to go back into the past, into the history of my family and the history of my country, and weave together a story. And it's very interesting because the story that I showed you right here was very political. And in it, I state my intent, what I believe in, what my political views are. But when I started working in fatherland, I realized that if I take a stance, I'm no longer telling a story. I'm convincing people of my own political stance. And so I decided not to do that. I decided to assume a completely neutral standpoint when it comes to this story. The story itself is extremely difficult. It is personal. It is not only about the dissolution of my family due to politics. It's about the dissolution of a country I grew up in. One reflected the other. And this is where I learned that if you want to make an impact, you have to speak from the heart. You have to speak about what you know. I cannot make a book about injustices happening in Ukraine right now or in Palestine. That's not my story to tell. My story to tell is my own personal story. And if it's also political, then it's true. These are some of the pages from Fatherland. Now, my third book was called Bezimena, and it is an allegory of the myth of Artemis or Diana, the goddess of hunt, the goddess of the forests, the virgin goddess. There is quite a few myths connected to her, but the one that I was interested in was, and there are several versions. What happens when when a man tries to invade the privacy of Artemis? In one version of the legend of the Cyprites, she's seen bathing naked. In another one, she is sexually violated by the young hunter. Whichever version we take into consideration, the punishment for this young man was that Artemis turned him into a deer, and then his own dogs attacked him and took him apart. So this is a completely fictional story. However, it is told from the point of view of a rapist or a perpetrator and the fantasy world that the perpetrator builds. And speaking of afterwards, as I was talking earlier about Chester Brown, who has extensive notes at the end of his books, I wrote an afterword at the end of this book in which I describe the incidences in my own life which have inspired this story. But the influences, visual and narrative, in this book are mostly by Jean Cocteau and his movies, the Orpheus trilogy. What I was saying earlier, that influences come from many different spheres. You don't have to be inspired as a cartoonist by other comics. As a matter of fact, I very rarely read comics. I'm very much afraid that I would get influenced by somebody and copy somebody's idea. So my influences come from film, from literature, they come from plays. And this one, the narrative of this book was inspired by a BBC television series by Dennis Potter called The Singing Detective. The structure of the series is that there is a book inside of the story. So the storyline fluctuates, goes between the real life, the now, the present moment, and the book that the hero of the film wrote. My fourth book is called La Réparation, and it is a 25-page silent comic. It is an homage to the Belgian artist Frans Masserel, who did woodcuts, stories told in woodcuts, in just images. The homage was to his first book, which only contained 25 images. The French publisher is one of the exclusive publishers of Masserel's work in France. And he also hires comics artists to produce 25-page books as an homage to Masserel. And I believe mine was fourth in the row. The story is very personal. After that, I realized that I've told all the personal stories I had to tell, and I basically ran out of stories to tell for now. But in 2017, I spent 1 year in France. I was doing comics. I was at a comics residence, and the initial idea was to study the French publishing scene, because, especially in comics, because the French comics publishing is, next to Japanese, the most successful in the world. It's not just the publishing of comics, but publishing of books, period. And I was really interested in why it's so successful? What is it about the French model that is so successful? At the same time, the French edition of Bezumena had come out, and I was to use the book tour and um, the Angoulême Festival to study the French publishing industry. So I was interviewing publishers and distributors and other artists. And what I realized was that whatever happens, the way that the profit is distributed in the publishing industry, the artist always receives the smallest cut. So this is something that I would like to share with you all, because I hope that at least one person here that is able to sometime in the future change something about this. The profit of the book is distributed in such a way that 20% go to the publisher, 30% of the profit goes to distributor, and 40% goes to the bookseller. 10% go to the artist, but in reality, it's more like 8 to 9%. I realized that I really didn't want to write about my findings about the French publishing industry, even though they publish about 5,000 titles per year in comics. It was just extremely demoralizing, and I didn't want to really focus on it for any extended periods of time. But what happened while I was in France, I started thinking about the tarot, because during my stay, I was hired to produce some illustrations for a book cover and inside of the book. And one of the components of the illustration was a Green Reaper, death itself. I drew 2 different versions of the Green Reaper, and the version that was rejected, that the publisher didn't like, reminded me of a death card in the tarot. And so I started drawing around it, started drawing the frame around it. I started making it look like the tarot card, and it just started coming out of me. And eventually I continued to draw the tarot. Now, if you're familiar with the tarot, it has 78 cards, but 22 of these cards are sort of separate. So if one is to use the cards for cartomancy, they can use all 78 cards, or they can use 22 cards of the major arcana. The major arcana signifies destiny cards. These are archetypes, signifying a journey of a person through life. So I settled down to designing only the 22 cards. And again, the way I started doing comics, I had no idea if I was going to do anything with these cards. This was a passion project. This is something that I felt I wanted to do and needed to do. I had always been interested in esoteric philosophy and the tarot. I've read a lot about it. I studied a lot about it, but I always thought this was going to be something personal that I'm not going to share with anybody. But then I realized that the tarot was becoming more and more popular. And eventually, after producing a limited edition set of these cards with the Italian publisher Strane Edizioni, we produced 300 copies of only the cards within the box. These cards in 2020, during the first year of pandemic, they sold immediately. And I, again, was approached by a publisher to publish these cards and to write a book, a guidebook about the tarot. So these are some of the illustrations that I did for the book. I sat down and I wrote the book, and now we have them in several different languages, in French, Italian, in Portuguese, Brazil Portuguese, and English. Now, so that is the part about my books and my comics. Part of my practice is also doing illustration, and this is something that I started doing more and more throughout the years. I've done some nature or some illustration that includes city of Toronto department for the parks and community. We had in Toronto, we had big parks and protected green areas with wildlife, and what the city of Toronto did was place signage of what wildlife is available in the area and some descriptions. So I was hired to do this, and this is my first illustration job. I still do botanical illustration. This was done recently for a perfume company. Among some of the first literary illustrations were for small Canadian magazines, literary magazines, and for small publishers. So the illustration on the left was produced for Exile Publishing book of poetry by the Canadian-Russian poet Vladimir Azarov. On the right is a small spot illustration that I produced for Toronto literary magazine called Tattle Creek. This illustration was eventually reduced down to maybe like 5 centimeters to be placed between different paragraphs in the article. On the left is the book cover design I did for another Canadian publisher, ALUO. It's a French-Canadian publisher based in Quebec City. This is the French edition of a book by Shuji Gardner, which is an excellent book. I highly recommend it. On the right is the inside cover illustration. Perhaps my favorite project for now is Fiaba Bianca by the Italian author Antonio Maresca, whom I met during a tour in the south of France for a prize that was awarded to authors, literary authors, and comics authors by high school students and apprentices. So part of the project was to go on a tour of high schools and libraries and talk about your work. And then everybody comes back again during the ceremony and we meet other authors. So I met Antonio Maresca in the south of France. We clicked and eventually decided to work on a project together. Again, I'm talking about this because I really want to put this across. If you do your work with passion, if you're true to yourself, if you engage with people with whom you're on the same frequency, you never know who will see your work, and you never know what other door will open for you and what wonderful treasures hide behind it. This was a book which Antonio eventually went home and wrote, and it's a beautiful story about the grandfather who rides from the city of the dead every day into the city to take his granddaughter to school. It's very touching, and it's about finding light in the darkest of times. On the right is a monster that eats children while parents are too busy looking at their phones. This is another illustration from the book, and another. So from here on, I started receiving more commissions for illustration work. On the left is the poster I designed for the Toronto Comic Arts Festival this year. On the right is the portrait of H.G. Wells I produced for the New Yorker magazine. This is an illustration produced this year as well for the New Republic magazine. Poster design for a culture festival at the city of Angoulême in France, where I had been doing my residence. And there's illustrations that I just do for myself because I enjoy drawing things that I pick the themes for. On the left is a drawing of Francesco Lantini, who was a circus performer, American circus performer. On the right is a drawing that I did while on vacation at a cottage, and I gave it to a silkscreen publishing outfit in Serbia and Belgrade called Matriarchia, or matriarchy. They basically printed a poster out of this. And because they travel all over Europe, they're connected with the underground comics industry. This poster was sold all over Europe, and I found out a few years ago that this particular poster was seen by the person I was talking to at about 5 homes in Brussels. So again, sometimes connecting with small publishing outfits who are well connected can bring you a lot success as if you were dealing with a big publisher. And I would at this point like to point out that the underground comics publishing, or the underground comic scene in former Balkan countries, is something that rose up from dissolution of the country and dissolution of the many comics magazines that we had in Yugoslavia. All of these publishing houses died or were suspended for a while. What started happening is that the underground comics in Croatia, in Serbia, so we had striparke in Slovenia, we had kamikaze in Croatia, we had many different outfits in Serbia, especially the kitchen comics with Aleksandar Zograf. The collaboration between the artists in different former Yugoslavian republics in the underground continued even when there was war going on. And this was something life-changing for me, because looking at what was happening in Yugoslavia from the distance, I realized, oh my God, like what's happening? This is craziness. We're the normal people. And I found out that the normal people went into the underground. So there's always been exchanges. Striparke would publish artists from Macedonia and Serbia and Bosnia and vice versa. And that continues to this day. And that's something that we cannot forget. Current work. So now that I am in love with esoteric philosophy again, and plan on producing the entire tarot deck, I am sharing some of my current work, which is very much inspired by esoteric philosophy, Rosicrucianism, and I have moved on to eco themes more. So the ecology and nature interest me more. I have become somewhat apolitical. These are the works that I have produced this year for a gallery in Paris for an exhibit, which will take place in January. And that's about it. All right. I think that I basically covered everything I wanted to cover, just 3 minutes after an hour, but I would like to see if any of you have any questions for me. I would love to answer them. So if Sada wants to take over.
Najprej en aplavz.
Thank you. Thank you. I hope I wasn't too boring.
Thank you, Nina. Do we have any questions? Maybe on Dolinka?
Dolinka, any questions?
Hello, everyone. We would firstly like to really thank you, Nina, that you can be with us, that you shared your work, all your experiences and the knowledge. So thank you, first of all. And now, of course, I am passing the word to our students of illustration and other from visual communications. So if there are questions, do ask.
I have a question. I have to turn this way, right?
Yeah. So,
How have you said? Okay. Okay.
Hi.
Hello. So to me, it felt really, you have like a really distinct style in which you draw, in which you do your work. And I was wondering whether you ever felt, if you always feel comfortable, if you're always happy to go back to this style, or if you ever feel trapped, like if you want to try something new and like people don't want to publish it, is that does ever happen? Or yeah, what's your perspective on like a style that you have to kind of do your entire life?
That's an excellent question, because that's something that I have been grappling with ever since Fatherland came out. Number one, I felt a little bit trapped because everybody saw me as this political artist. And I didn't see myself. I was political, but I didn't want to be put in that category. And it's the same with the style of drawing. I have slightly changed the style for my tarot because you shrink it down from the original and it has to still retain the detail. And I realized that going from that style of stippling and cross-hatching to woodcut style was pretty seamless. The people like both now. So I think that, but that I had to invent the different style because of the project. And it just happened. The way I say is like, instead of like focusing on feeling trapped, focus on the task that you have right now. What style works best for this project? And generally, I don't like to be trapped. I enjoy my freedom. And I think that I enjoy working with cross-hatching and stippling, but I think that if I introduce more black surfaces and more white surfaces, that it gives me a little bit of a breathing place. So not everything is done in the detail, like you actually have, oh my God, I'm going to just, paint everything black in this area. And so you have to find the right balance. I would say that I have slowly been moving from one style to the next, and I don't know what my style will be next. I didn't know that I would even be doing this when I was doing sculptures. So I think, yes, I have felt trapped at times. I thought that people were expecting certain things of me, but it's not that they were expecting my lines and cross-stitching, whatever, but I think that they were just expecting to see the best technique for the project. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, any other questions?
Yes.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
So my question would be maybe mostly related to the fatherland story, in the sense that as someone trying to tell an objective story about something that I assume is very personal to you and possibly traumatic to you, something that you lived through, how do you was it difficult for you, and how did you achieve the separation of your personal feelings toward the story from the actual story you ended up telling?
Okay. That's another excellent question. To be honest with you, it was quite easy because I turned on my journalistic lens. I started thinking about the story through facts. I researched the facts a lot. And I realized that if I told the story as it was, and if I presented it by paralleling personal experiences, so personal history, family history, and the history of the country, that I would do the job. I realized that the story itself was moving, was extremely heartbreaking. If I added any emotion on my part, it would be too sentimental. And people don't like that. People can tell bullshit. I wanted to leave it to the reader to draw their own political conclusions. I didn't want to be the person who tells people how to feel. So, and perhaps because I was very small at the time that the events from Fatherland took place. So I was 3 years old when the book ends. I have no memories of that. I think it would have been more painful for my mother to tell the story or my older sibling because they remember. They had a connection with my father. I did not. What I was grieving more than anything was the dissolution of my country because that was the country I grew up in. And that was a country that I had to leave. And the emotions that I had were about that, about the war, about the dissolution of my country and this and that. And that I didn't really get to write about very much in this book because I did not talk about timeline-wise. I did not talk about the 1990s. The story basically ends in 1977. So, but for those of you who consider writing personal stories, if you're working on personal story that has trauma in it, always have one foot out the door. Always be willing to walk away from the project. Because the most important thing is your mental health. Perhaps sometime later, you will manage to tell the story. But first, you need to heal. So again, if something is too difficult, you don't have to tell the story. Perhaps it's not the time to tell the story. It was the right time for me to tell all of these stories. Again, the La Réparation, the book that's based on my childhood experiences of violence and abuse. I was supposed to work on the book that was going to have 120 pages. And after 2 months, I realized that I cannot spend 2 years working on something that's so painful for me. And so I walked away from the project. But when I was hired to do the 25-page book, I realized that I can do an allegory of this story. So I still told the story, but it was different. It was short. It took me 6 months to produce it, maybe even less. And it was far easier to do than if I was going to go, oh, this happened, and then I was home alone, and then this, and then that. It would be just too painful. So to answer your question, Fatherland was relatively easy to work on because it was not in the personal memory bank. But it was other story, my last comic, that was a little bit more difficult, but I had to find a different form to tell the story, the short form. I hope that answered your question.
It does. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
My question is quite simple, actually. How come you, what led you to decide to work mostly in black and white style?
That's very interesting. It's a very simple answer too. I really like the work of Charles Burns and Drew Friedman, and both of them work in black and white. I like noir films. I grew up with a black and white television, so everything I see is grayscale. I love paint. I like working in color, but I think that in addition to the moodiness that you get with black and white, it's very inexpensive to reproduce. Black and white is always cheaper to print. At least it was in the 1990s, in the early 2000s. So that is pretty much it. But I do think that I will eventually tackle color because I did do some oil painting before I started doing comics. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thanks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Kdo?
Just another one.
Aha.
Hello.
Hello.
I was wondering, I guess this is a question more of like a business perspective. It's very amazing what you've done like in your lifetime and everything you told us, and all the art, all the works that were very impactful. And it's kind of intimidating, especially being a student. And I was wondering, I don't know if you have any advice for us, maybe how to, I mean, I know you said that we should tell our stories and tell something that's true, but yeah, I don't know how to maybe make sense of what we do in our world and how to make an impact and how to be not successful, but proud of our works and do something with it. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, I think I know where you're going with the question. And this is something that I have few pieces of practical advice. Now let's go financially. Let's talk about finances. In the beginning, you will have to do some free work or for very little money. Contribute to magazines, contribute to this and that. But that's a very short time. That's a very short time. And choose wisely. Choose wisely. Value yourself and your work and learn to say no. Because if somebody's not offering you enough money for your work, your time is better spent working on something that will bring you money eventually, or perfecting your skills or doing something. You're in a better position working in a coffee shop as long as you get to do what you want to do and follow your own inner voice. That's very important. Number two, your originals, whether you do illustration, whether you do comics, make sure that your originals are done on good paper with India ink, no pilot pens. After 10 years, anything that you draw with pilot pens will turn purple. Think about what will last. Liquid paper. No. That will dry and flake off in 10 years. use gouache, white tempera, to correct your mistakes. Use inks, use watercolor, tempera paint, everything that is traditional. I am also like, I don't know if I use Posca markers right now, but I don't know. They have not been around for too long. I don't know how long they will last. Because your originals are the biggest source of my income right now. I make very little money from my books. I make money from illustration and from the sales of originals. So treat your originals as if they're going to be museum exhibits one day. That's number one. It's always good to have a backup strategy, a job you do while you're establishing yourself, so you can produce the work that you would be proud of and have your portfolio ready. Social media, it's very important to have presence of social media and present your work and less about your opinions about the world, because people don't like that. Everybody has opinions. People are so sick and tired of it. People just want to see art from the artist pages, you know? And I would say that if you knock on the door of a publisher and they don't like your work, that door is closed. Keep looking for a door that will open. You cannot keep knocking on the door that's not open to you. Go to the other door. Eventually, you will find the right publisher, you will find the right clients, and connect with people that have similar sensibilities with other artists. And kind of like take the approach of going with the flow. If something feels like you're forcing it, listen to you. Listen to how you feel about working. Listen to your body. If you have a job that's like I have met young cartoonists, especially women, who work so hard because they have this tight deadline to finish a book, because they are afraid to ask the publisher to give them an extension, because they think that they will lose the contract. No, don't be afraid to ask for what you need. Never work to the point of exhaustion. That's the thing. So these are a few pieces of advice that I would like to give, and be good to yourself. That's the most important thing. And learn, keep learning from different sources. The more you learn, the better you become as an artist. The more you have to express, the more you have to give to the world. So read, watch good films and documentaries, and talk to interesting people, because all of that will find its way into your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right.
Yeah.
I
you
think that
said it all. Yes.
I think that's it. I think we're done.
Yeah. So thank you again. Another applause.
Thank you so much. Thank you to everyone, and to people who asked the questions, and everybody who listened patiently. I can't believe you're still there, all of you. So anyway, you have a wonderful day, and the best of luck in your future careers.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you so much.